I've spent many years now harping on about the power of stories. As I always say, they're exaggerated versions of our own world. They take concepts we all know and feel, but put them into a context that's more clear and concise than our own world, written with a definitive start and endpoint and the intent of an author. Even something purposefully unclear has the advantage of beginning and ending. Unlike our own feelings or selves, they won't grow and change to obscure the point. They're teachers for us in a way. But also, the world is quite harsh and unforgiving, more for some and always in different ways, but it's undeniable that at the very least, every single person will experience a few bad days which in some way twist and distort our own stories. We don't always want to put in the active effort to be taught, and in those moments, we often turn to stories to help. While they do hold a lot of power, they're also a tool of forgetting such power even when that's their purpose. Psychopaths is my favorite story of all time, and I will likely argue to my death the greatest one ever told, even if it is derivative of earlier cyberpunk works. The entire story, top to bottom, is a lesson in ethics and the point of society, finding the intersection of not just right and wrong, but why we decide what is right and wrong, and how important it is to maintain the spirit that leads us to do so. It's dark, depressing, featuring a cyclical ending in typical Euro Butcher fashion, which leaves only room for consideration since our own days, weeks, months, and even years themselves end the same way. And yet, despite all of that, despite 10 plus video essays on the series and its themes, despite the anime having literal pools of blood where bodies used to be, the series is like a big warm blanket to me. I watched it in every place I've ever lived since I left my childhood home. It was my philosophical awakening that put me where I am right now. I cosplayed one of the leads and constantly meme the villain because I think he's the greatest thing to ever exist, even though he's literally a psychopath. It's a big part of my life, and call this however cringe you want, but a big part of who I am and the mindset I tackle the world around me with. The point is, even a series which is fully expressing the intent to make us think can also be like a nice escapist piece at times, a weighted blanket so that we can escape into the happy memories of our own space and mind, rather than escaping outside of our bounds. But this also means that the opposite can be true. A story doesn't need to have carefully crafted themes and realistically written dialogue and philosophical reference to teach us something. They're comfortable either way because they purposefully draw in our attention. Whether it's a serious story like Psychopaths or the comedies that we're about to explore, some elements of the story are meant to be relatable, warm, and comforting so that we care. We devote some part of our brain's processing to understanding them because we care. Additionally, they will always have their causes and effects because of plot, and so through those we can develop logic to pick out a lesson of some sort from any story. X happened because of Y. If I do X, then Y will happen as well. Because of this, what happens when a comforting story leads us to the wrong conclusions, when it doesn't have the careful guardrails written into a serious story like Psychopaths. A popular, probably too popular, example is The Office. UK friends, but you probably knew that was coming. Jim is unequivocally the hero of the series. He's made out to be the sensible yet still fun and relatable everyday man pushing through a job he hates like anyone else. His pranks are lobbied against Dwight because his rival embodies many of those ridiculous and crazy aspects expected of us all while at work. When he tricks the overly enthused paper salesman into climbing a telephone pole with some mysterious wire, even though it's dangerous and kind of mean-spirited, we feel like he's justified because Dwight is falling for it in a way that's just as ridiculous, thinking it's some grand conspiracy. He's overbearing, way too into his work, sucks up to the boss, and is just as mean-spirited as Jim, but really for the sake of being so, not for any other reason. Jim is the average dude fighting back against daily toil in small, technically achievable ways, if not exaggerated in some aspects. But that's what we said, exaggeration for the sake of example and understanding. It makes the point clear, and it's overall a good message we can pull from the series. The world is going to beat us down with these responsibilities we never wanted to have. Little windows of opportunity may be all we get to find some break in it all, and so we have to take those little breaks in all their glory, make them into something kind of ridiculous. Nobody wants to be the paper salesman at a failing company, but it's a situation we'd end up in nonetheless, so we make do by taking back little bits from what was taken from us. The story is relatable. This and its overall warmth make it comfortable, and through that we develop a desire to follow the series' lead. I've played a few minor pranks on one coworker I'm actually friends with at my awful job, exactly because it is my awful job. I label a tool I know he'll need for use by anyone but him, or call him pocket change because he's short and said the phrase one day. For a second, you forget about the fact that it's so awful, even when you're living it. It's kind of just like how we forget while watching a comforting series. It spills over into our world somewhat, whether we like it or not, whether we intend it to or not, because we're creatures who desire to be smart and understand the logic we're being presented with, no matter what we think. So what happens when our hearts are won by a series and its lovable characters, but the message we can draw from it isn't so positive, even if it's presented as such? Once Jim and Pam get past the will they won't they's, Jim makes the decision to, without asking her, buy his parents' home for the pair to live in. Of course, despite its quirky flaws, unideal nature, and the work needed, Pam loves the gesture and accepts it with open arms, leading to a classic The Office heartwarming moment. It's really a parallel to the entire series itself. The life they're living together is full of quirks like Michael and Dwight, unideal situations like working for a paper company rather than chasing a passion, but with some elbow grease and the intent to fix her up, or it'll become like a home to them. It's comfort in the unideal. But this gesture is actually kind of terrible. If someone I was in a relationship with bought a house we did not talk about getting, in an area we didn't discuss, with a payment I didn't consent to, with the intent to start a life there together, I'd be furious. Are you kidding me? That feels so controlling and awful, whatever the intent of it was. That's a life-changing decision, and it puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of the recipient. How could you say no to that, leaving someone you love with a payment they might not be able to handle alone? But this is nothing even considered in the series, not even talked about. It's not an issue at all to them. I was curious about any stories of something like this happening in the real world, and led me to one of the few places where Redditors' habits of being complete assholes to random strangers on the internet can do good. Am I the asshole? Now, the short of the story here is that the wife of a mid-late 20s couple put a deposit payment on a house without asking her husband of 2 years. He responded by refusing to talk about it and apparently ghosting her, which is, I think, an inappropriate response, to be fair. I mean, if the issue is communication on her end, then communicate. Don't do the same thing you're mad at them for. But she asked if she was the asshole for putting the deposit on a house, not for how they dealt with the situation, and the internet spoke. Oh, they spoke. She was the asshole. It wasn't even a question. Every single comment is stating firmly and directly that the issue was about partnership. These two agreed to make major life decisions together because they committed to trusting and loving each other more than the ability to choose exactly what they wanted and exactly when they wanted it. And she broke that. She didn't do that. She made a major decision based on what was special to her without even considering what her partner thought or stopping to think that he might think about it. Even if they could afford it, even if it was just a place for the weekends, it's the premise of it all. And that was just the deposit, and the internet slaughtered this woman's actions. In The Office, Jim buys a whole house on the salaries of two struggling small town in the middle of nowhere paper company branch office workers, and it is met with complete and total acceptance, not even a peep about trust or communication. It's telling us that there are things more important than those, that the joy of surprise and gift is above the base elements of partnership. Essentially, all of the responsibility is put on Pam as the one receiving the gift to put aside any negative feelings and understand the good intent of Jim's actions, even when he himself admits it's reckless and stupid. She has to act on those core aspects, even though he bypassed them. It's not something which spoils the entire series, however. Excluding some of the later episodes, the core of Jim and Pam's relationship is expressed through small, meaningful gestures which hold emotional weight rather than financial responsibility. There's the teapot full of memories he gives her for Christmas, which, due to a childish game by Michael, is directly compared to the iPod in terms of value. One was, for 2005, an expensive and flashy gift, while the other was mundane, leading to even Pam, who wanted such a thing, to say,
I mean, it's an iPad.
man, that makes the story feel as dated as how, like, any Seinfeld plot is ruined by the mere existence of a cell phone. But despite all of this commotion and value talk, Pam eventually gives the iPod up to Dwight in exchange for the teapot, which to her surprise is filled with little memories Jim kept from their time together. An old high school photo of Jim she laughed at, a hot sauce brand she thought was ketchup and put on a hot dog by accident. It's little jokes and memories which create a positive and heartwarming message we probably already know but can never hurt to be reminded of in something we draw comfort from. The value of a gift isn't in, well, value, a dollar amount, but in how it makes us feel, how it brings us together. There are thousands of iPods out there, but there's only one teapot full of their memories. Which is really worth more when you consider that. It's in line with the series' overall theme of escaping mundane exhaustion through simple gestures, and this is one any of us could replicate with no problem. I always kept little memories from my high school relationship because of this episode. Ticket stubs from concerts, cards we made each other because we always did custom photoshops instead of just buying them. It was all those little memories which represented moments where we did escape mundanity through the other. Even when we were apart, working on one of those cards made the night feel a lot more meaningful and purposeful than playing video games alone. Actually, give me 1 second. I literally still have the box right here that I kept the stuff in. Now, of course, that all led to me having to burn it all in a parking lot one night after she purposely ruined my life, but hey, what are you gonna do? The point is, The Office was, despite dated humor in some episodes, overwhelmingly positive. There's multiple instances where it helped me and a lot of people much more than it led somewhere negative, from the comfort it provided to the multiple times where lessons and examples from it gave me a deeper relationship. And had the series done less to redeem Michael, that so-so humor would have been much more forgivable because the point wasn't laughing at different cultures or lifestyles, it was laughing at the absurdity of how the hell was this man a manager? The series had some dangerous moments because of the inherent nature of storytelling logic. However, when we take it as a whole, we can see that the intent was overall good. By looking deeper into the series with a critical eye, respecting that even comedy can be impactful, we can move past its less savory aspects and appreciate it as something very much worthy of comforting us. So we've seen how and why series are comforting, shown how we can appreciate them even if they hold some negative aspects by analyzing and understanding them in full, and through that we can be okay with their comfort. But what if it's something that seems to have good intent but then almost feels like it betrays it at times? MASH, a sitcom set at a mobile army hospital in the Korean War, is one of my all-time favorite series, largely because it's one of the few things commonly enjoyed between me and my father. As such, it's something I have to reckon with that it is a product of its time, which has some jokes and different aspects which do not hold up, and the fact that it's something very meaningful and comforting to me outside of that. Don't get me wrong, the series is one which was honestly progressive, airing primarily in the 1970s, yet striking a definitive and unmistakable anti-war tone both in its mockery of the military, like the incompetent commanding officer Henry Blake who signs forms without ever reading them, or in its praisal of what the core aspects of it should be, like his later replacement Sherman T. Potter, whose commentary is much more subtle, shown in his care even for enemy soldiers despite serving for America across 3 wars in 40-ish years. It also had episodes where the main characters Hawkeye Pierce and, at least in the early episodes, main character Trapper John, despite being aggressive womanizers, defend a gay soldier against the unjustified onslaught of their war fanatic bunkmate Frank Burns, or help a young Korean man raise money for college. Much like our later comedy, the point of MASH was dealing with common emotions through comedy. It aired in 1972, 1 year after the Pentagon Papers broke, which revealed just how much the American government was being actively deceptive about the Vietnam War. An entire generation of young men were sent overseas to fight for lies, coming home with scars that never healed, or not at all. MASH is a response to these feelings, presenting how drafted doctors maintain their sanity in the midst of patching up kids often not much older than 18, only to see them sent back to the front and die. As such, it's absurd, mirroring the very premise of its context, war, responding to things which make no sense with nonsense. The very first episode is the one where Hawkeye and Trapper raffle off a weekend in Tokyo with a nurse to raise money for Hojon to go to medical school, an insane premise which sees them all but literally spit in the face of military authority. There's bedpans worn as hats, and Officer is sedated by the hero so they can throw a wild party. They auction off a nurse to raise money, and that's they auction off a nurse to raise money. Even if they rig the auction to go to the priest, MASH has a bit of a problem with its genders. The men may be great surgeons who would do anything to save a life, dropping all of their vices the second they get into the OR, or even go the extra mile in their free time, but when they're not, they drink aggressively in a pit of filth they lovingly call the swamp, in between making a pass at every single feminine object that passes into the camp. And the women, or rather, Margaret Houlihan, the most prominent woman in the cast, is similarly dedicated, but also a manipulative other woman to the married Frank Burns who sleeps with generals for career advantage, gets hysterical at the smallest romantic upsets, chases money in her man, and is mostly defined by that bumbling fool Frank, even though she, outclasses him. Flaws are what's drawing the laugh track on both sides, man or woman. But the men's flaws are passed off as silly and lovable, even Hawkeye holding Margaret down and kissing her being the lovable, jokey end to an episode, while Margaret's are laughed at in a bit more of a malicious way. When Hawkeye and Trapper get called out, they get to smile and laugh, comfortable and content to embrace their flaws as acceptable, and it never holds them back from somehow seemingly sleeping with every single woman in camp, even though the joke is that they're kind of smelly drunks. They still get to be clever and heroic even after downing straight gin constantly. They're the gems of the series, the everyman fighting against an absurd daily life, even if the context is much different. But Margaret, even though part of the joke is about her uptight nature as a comically militant personality, is shocked at her flaws being presented, and when she succeeds through them, it's at the cost of the man she manipulates. Her agency drops out as she sleeps with a man at least twice her age because she's attracted to being a good general. The men get young, pretty nurses, and she gets ferret-faced Frank Burns and a bunch of bald old men. Yeah, it is playing both sides, an excuse often used for certain jokes. For example, the women similarly humiliate the men in a few revenge pranks, and Hawkeye gets his comeuppance for lying to try and get out of committed romance with the nurses. But the women are most often the ones being subjected to sexual jokes or pranks, and Hawkeye is only in that situation because when it seems the war is about to end, every nurse assumes they'll go home and get married to him. The root is stereotypes that let men off easy and put women into an unlikable position, seen as the ball and chain sucking out the fun once they get what they want. We see that it's heavily influenced by the stereotypes of its time. Men paid women lower if they hired them at all, so the only option they were presented with and actively raised to seek was marriage. It was the only realistic way that the world told them they could build a life of their own, and that life was just taking care of not just kids, but a man who could freely get drunk and be as dirty as he wished. Well, these stereotypes aren't true. Any evidence of it was created by the ones benefiting from it to begin with. It was, in heavy quotes, true for its time, in that people did believe it. But we'll keep that in mind as we're moving forward. But I had to keep saying Hawkeye, Trapper, and Frank rather than just the surgeons, because MASH went through quite a change as it progressed. Hawkeye and Margaret would stay, but Trapper would be replaced by the faithfully married BJ Honeycutt, and the antagonistic role Frank filled would eventually go to Charles Winchester, who, despite being a borderline bigoted, filthy rich snob, is probably my favorite character of the entire series, mostly for the late David Ogden Stier's stunning performance. Everyone was good, but check out the card on screen now to see just how next level he was. I'm not even going to pull the YouTuber after this video, of course, joke. Go watch that right now, and even now, go watch the entire series instead of this silly video on it if you like that clip. But with these new characters, including the change to Colonel Potter as well, the tone of MASH overall shifted. It wasn't as much an absurd comedy anymore, but rather leaned into the dramatic aspects which took a backseat in the early episodes, focusing more on meaningful, single-episode stories and heartwarming moments. And with this came big changes for Margaret. Detached from the overly antagonistic Frank Burns, she was freed from being a bouncing pad for the series' core themes and could instead contribute to them through depth just the same as the surgeons, although there were plenty of moments before these changes as well, they were just more clear afterwards. No matter the circumstances or conditions, she's just as heroic as the male leads. In fact, much more so in any serious matters outside of doctoring. Anytime there's danger close to the front they have to address, she's the only one to openly volunteer and do her duty, while the men cower in either a realistic aversion to war or extreme hypocrisy. When the Jeep gets a flat tire, it's not Hawkeye changing it while Margaret freaks out, it's her doing the work while he's just sitting there. This goes into the respect Hawkeye and Margaret have for each other as well, with the former going so far as to trust her to perform some aspects of surgery when the circumstances are dire, affirming her that of course she can do it. In the time MASH was set, she could only be a nurse as far as the military was concerned. But the show knew someone like her could do more, and the first instance of this happens well before the tonal shift of later seasons. Not only was she respected with agency, even if the jokes could go against us many times, but she also became core to the series' themes as it progressed. Margaret wasn't a major for no reason. She was a tough, no-nonsense taskmaster. There was a job to do in regards to saving lives, and she would be the one to make sure it got done all above her own needs. This was her reaction to the absurdity of war, the tragedy of death, and the intersection of duty and freedom we can observe in any of the surgeons. Where they goofed off and got drunk, she dug deeper into her work, putting up a tough, stoic front. How could she relax when there was so much on her shoulders? But that's the point. That's something we probably all feel to some extent. And we see how it affected her to never let loose. She was isolated from her staff as all the nurses feared how she'd react to anything that wasn't exactly code. Because of her duties, she appeared as someone who couldn't even attempt to have fun. She would love to sit and drink coffee and eat fudge with them, but she refuses to show the softness to ask because they're in a war, and so they assume she wouldn't like to because of the tough persona. It's a self-feeding cycle, and it goes hand in hand with why the others do such silly things. It's the only way they know to not go crazy in a hellish situation. Nonsense for nonsense. Margaret becomes a part of this, making her key to understanding the point of the show, not just a bouncing pad for the others. Plus, her unlikable aspects here aren't femininity or a lack of it either, but independent of either side, independent of gender. It's who she is as a person responding to tragedy, not who she is as a woman responding to tragedy. And they'd actively work against some of these stereotypes in her in the later episodes. She refuses to see a soldier who expects her to be a perfect picture of femininity and nothing else for him, divorces an unfaithful husband to go off on her own, and her final act of the series is to go against her father's plans for her career, the man who determined her whole life so far, and instead adapt what she had built with her own hands through that into what she wants. Margaret is a story of liberation from exactly what early MASH assumed every woman would be. While the later shift doesn't excuse the entire series, I told you to keep the belief in those stereotypes in mind as we discuss the positive aspects of her character, because they show that the series was truly misguided. It was not actively written with a desire to belittle women, at least not on the whole, I think we can assume, but instead it did so through a false mindset of the time, which, again, with due responsibility, they should have known better to work through on their own. I think this is the kind of situation where we can reasonably employ the phrase, though, a product of its time, because those flaws were genuinely expressed commonly at that time, but further, it also showed a willingness to not just learn and become better, but also from the start included aspects which proved it treated its characters as more than stereotypes, despite the inclusion of some. Although I do have to end this section by stating I've only seen what airs of the show now, almost 50 years later, and how it might have been edited. There may be some cut episodes or scenes that I'm not aware of as a viewer all this time later. This video has turned into something much larger and different than expected, and I'm going to be finishing it the day before you see it, so I'm going to have to rush this next section for time, but it's the simplest one, and the kind of shows I want to give the least air to. I'm not even going to use clips of them. But we can see shows which are called products of their time, but are really just mean-spirited, and looking back, we just kind of assume they were the times because stuff like this existed then. It shows like 2.5 Men, which, just to be brief about it, doesn't lean into stereotypes of the time, but actively exaggerates and worsens them. It is a similar issue of men being presented as pigs, but being rewarded anyway. But that show actively uses women as sex objects, and they're not just played as jokes, but are often made to admit they were wrong when guys act up to falsely prove the idea of overreacting women. There's no absurd reality being pointed to. It's just a rich guy being an ass and getting rewarded because he's supposedly smooth and attractive. At least Alan Alda gave Hawkeye some genuine charm. Instead, 2.5 Men just kind of thought bowling shirts were cool. To bring it back to something in between our serious first example and our silly middle two though, I think we can look at a modern piece which, when we dig deeper into it, shows exactly how to set up the guardrails of a serious series with an intended message without ever breaking an inherently comforting intent and with genuinely impressive levels of humor. Bo Burnham's Inside. Yeah, apparently I said fuck anime today. I know that this is supposed to be a video on Trigun. This is not a video on Trigun. I've been watching his return special a lot recently, feeling like it's okay to watch it twice in one day because it has catchy songs in it, so it's kind of like having music on in the background. They're stuck in my head anyway, so I might as well just listen to the whole special, right? But I really know that it's because I was somewhat envious. He was almost 10 years younger than I am now when he took off. He made theaters full of people laugh, and even though our mediums are completely different, he goes about it with the intensity, emotion, and absurdity that I could only dream of producing. The most giddy I get about the special is in the moments of insanity and absolute expression. I think that if I locked myself in a room for over a year, would I be able to make something that good? To express myself that well? After one watch of Inside, I would have said hell no. It was so impossible to match, that tortured creative genius capable of making us laugh even through the unflinching harshness of a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy, presenting a downward spiral as something meaningful in the same hour and a half as songs which see himself pressed up against the wall with the word balls. It's so silly, but it's also so impressive. Watching him do a reaction to a reaction to a reaction to a reaction is hilarious, but also a genuine commentary on the medium and an inventive and well-produced way to present it. It serves like 3 or 4 purposes at once, even if on the first pass it just looks like silly comedy. I mean, this man is just a genius, right? I kind of never wanted to watch it again once I finished. It made me feel like a creative failure, each carefully produced shot which was the work of one man alone, a stinging reminder that I'd never done the same. But after a couple more watches where I was really paying attention and giving it a critical eye, I thought of course I'd be able to do something like that. And the reason is because he was careful with the story being told within his jokes and songs. He doesn't present this special as something perfect. As he says, it was one man alone in a room making a special without a plan. He goes a bit mad laying surrounded by wires. He gets a bit angry surrounded by lights and cameras and monitors. We watch him turn 30 alone, questioning if he can ever get this done, and if he even wants to, because when he does, there won't be any purpose to the time that's passing. It's the creator who accepts the torturous creation because to suffer with reason is more certain than to wander in boredom. It's not the best aspects I'm lacking in my creation, it's the worst ones that I struggle with too. Yeah, 70-hour weeks really fucking sucks between this and work, but it's also less painful than sitting on the couch and watching the hours pass by. This whole special is real and raw, and not only does it make it more powerful considering the context of when it was made in 2020, but it also makes it clear that it wasn't easy. Eventually, when I really took everything in after my first gleeful pass at seeing one of the most creative minds of our time return, I started to be less envious. It started when I really saw all the equipment he needed to make this. It reminded me of part of the reason why I couldn't do this is because I don't have the money to buy all that stuff or the time to test it all and set it all up. I started to feel grateful that I wasn't making my own Inside actually. I mean, it looked like a massive pain. I get nervous about moving one camera and a couple lights. I bought a few bottles and some labels, and I was so overwhelmed I had to reorganize every single possession I owned. You want me to manage all those wires and lights and cameras and monitors? You want me to lay them out for one shot just like that? Jesus Christ. Maybe I'm not quite ready for such a big project. I don't have that time and expertise, and no one should have to. This was only produced by one man because it was a fucking pandemic. By having that equipment in frame, all the setup shots and mistakes, and letting that be a crucial part of the show, it added an extra dimension that helped to dispel that tortured creativity is worthwhile narrative. It also was helped along by a constant running joke through the hour and a half, which is that in a time of struggle that was 2020 for anyone below a certain class status, worse than if they weren't white, the special was giving us all comfort was made by a rich white guy. One of the opening songs is all about this, and many other jokes or lines throughout the special remind us of that fact. There's no end to them, there's no solution presented, but he can't simply sit back and suffer. That wouldn't help anyone. He's a comedian, and coming with that job is taking the spotlight. We can't say he should suffer for other people not to. But it is important to dispel some feelings of worthlessness that come from contrasting what we may have managed during a pandemic and what he did, and see why he was able to. Our work will be lost to time, what we did during that year of 2020 and the ones that followed. Well, his won awards and were loved by everyone. But as he says, it's in part because he's a rich white guy. It took a lot of time and effort shown by the setup and his frustration, but of course that's something we all experience. It's not the sole determining factor of success. With this careful balance that Inside strikes, it keeps that comfort without ever falling to the jealousy that I started to maybe feel early on. But we looked at MASH and its treatment of women, so let's see a similar example in Inside. This is seriously about to sound like the stupidest thing I've ever said in a video, but the song White Woman's Instagram is actually a great example of how you avoid the pitfalls of storytelling we went over. Ever since the advent of hating on the pumpkin spice latte, there's been a specific culture of dunking on the basic bitch, which is really just code for any girl who does something remotely popular and enjoys it. These things become markers of femininity on the whole, and so they're attacked as a cloaked war against femininity with the unwitting backing of many online sharing memes or funny posts with a simple click. It's meant to slip under your nose, to feel normal and natural because it's designed in that relatable way to keep a hierarchy in place. If someone says all women like the same stupid things, it's gonna sound more reasonable after you've seen 170 memes that basically all say that. There's also a lot of undertones here about how the idea of a basic bitch is defined around mostly white individuals and what that says about the expectations placed on people on the whole, but I don't think I'm really the person to be addressing that. Even if I'm not a guy, I was still raised as one for most of my life, and while I'm almost painfully blinding levels of white. But when you see Bo come out and sing a whole song that's just examples of what a white woman would post on Instagram, from Tiny Pumpkins to Lord of the Ring quotes accidentally attributed to Martin Luther King, pointing out the absurdity of it all for comedic effect, it might feel like more dunking on this real-life trope slapped on people just trying to enjoy life. And of course, it is making fun of it. There's something funny about seeing the same person who was just opening a laptop alone in the dark suddenly acting so joyful and happy. I mean, it's clear that no one's life, at least no one any of us probably know, is that put together and happy. And this was 2020, where we were even less so put together. The joke isn't about women enjoying things. After all, he never actually makes a joke in the whole song. All he's doing is listing items. The joke is this perfect collection of so many picturesque and perfectly presented, overly pretty and trying to be meaningful things at once. The main line is a jab at this. Is it heaven or a white woman's Instagram? Nothing is that perfect. And the way he creates this effect is by betraying the rest of the special, which is all about degradation. This is one of the few sections to feature almost none of the equipment or setup. Every shot is spot on perfect to the thing he's poking fun at, which means he went through all the trouble to buy these things, set them up, play the part, record it all, and then use each shot for maybe 5 seconds at most. I mean, think about that. It's outfits down to the little details like a choker, props he'll probably never use again, the persona for each shot, just for one quick, pretty image from someone who's actually losing their mind. That's kind of the joke, isn't it? Any of these things alone wouldn't be funny, but back to back to back and within context, it gets comical. No one is this happy and perfect. And that's a direct acknowledgement within the song as well. The only section of White Woman's Instagram which isn't a list of items is also the section where the frame expands and it shows a bit more of the mess and the setup for all these shots. The song turns into a quick story with the white woman explaining a post in memory of her mother who passed 10 years ago and the emotions that go along with that. How she's still getting over the loss to this day but is finding solace in little aspects of life that her mother would be proud of. Being so happy about little things makes life easier when we all have to deal with loss like that, even if we present it in such a corny way. It's as if the expanding frame to show the mess is saying, of course people aren't this perfect. Look past the frame and you'll see how deep they really are. And so the joke isn't about women. The joke is about presentation. It's entirely possible to make fun of things or people in a way that isn't mean-spirited. That's what the whole special is doing. It's having Sako take over a fun little kid's song with depressing facts about the real world, which is true and reminds us of those things and is funny through that contrast, but it's also poking fun at how sometimes we get so focused on those things we spoil the fun. I know I do it more than I should. It's in Welcome to the Internet mentioning the weirdest, most fucked up stuff imaginable on the internet and how it might not be that healthy, but also how it's given many a special place to be that insatiable you who found their place among the weirdness and, for better or worse, found something good through that. Sexting is making fun of probably something anyone under the age of 30 has done, but it respects why we do such a silly thing as it ends so lonely. Most of the full songs have a slight breakdown like this where some kind of meaning shows through, kind of forcing us to do the whole point of what we did with those earlier comedies and what serious stories are all designed to do. To look deeper into them. Leaves us with a laugh, but also something to think about why we're laughing. It's a guardrail to get the right message since we'll get one no matter what. It's comfort without disrespecting why we needed comfort to begin with. The only way we can judge a series is by understanding the context it was made within, understanding the series itself, and exploring with others what at its core, what the soul of the story is. Yes, that is the corniest line ever, but it sounded really good, and making videos like this branded accessibly is really, really hard. You probably noticed this video was all over the place, like how I said earlier. It was supposed to be a video on Trigun. I watched Trigun Stampede and really wanted to talk about how I felt about Trigun, and it led to me making this video. So it's completely off the rails. I think there's something good in here. I kind of question videos like this, or the validity of videos like this on the whole, because it's kind of just looking at things in retrospect and justifying how we feel on them. So, it's never quite certain if it's actually the intent that was behind it or we have no way to say some of those things. It's really just guessing and trying to justify the comfort we're getting. But I think it does still have value in that because we're going to draw comfort from those things. And I think understanding why is important. There's nothing that's really meaningless because we're going to try to find meaning in everything. So even just a silly comfort series is something we can learn about ourselves through. And so this lines up with the point of this channel overall. I don't know, this one's wild. Again, don't really know where it was going. I just kind of wrote and it came out and I hope it was good. And now I have to go and find a bunch of clips to use in this video because I don't have any of them ready. So I should probably get to that. But I'll leave you with important links. There's Twitter, Discord, and Patreon all in the pinned comment. Most importantly, that last one with these lovely people above me helps support me making completely insane things like this. But thank you very much to them and to everyone alike for spending some time with me here today. And I hope that I'll see you again soon.